The government must announce a 3 lakh crore fiscal stimulus to boost the economy, is what the industry body, the Confederation of Indian Industry, has announced, adding that accelerated vaccination is the key to faster recovery. Now, the CII has a new president, TV Narendran, who has said in his first interaction with the media that the government's fiscal stimulus should be up to 1.3% of GDP. Now, CII is advocating ramping up vaccine production to at least 175 crores by 2021. We're very privileged to have Mr. Narendran with us on the program today in this very special interview. But the CII has actually come out with a couple of very interesting possibilities. It's all linked to vaccination in a sense of the road ahead for India's economic growth. So let's look at this. India's economic growth, three possibilities. Firstly, business as usual. Now, if it is business as usual, which does see a sizable number of citizens vaccinated, then they are projecting a 6.5% growth. But for this to happen, most of our population must be vaccinated. There needs to be few big ticket reforms. Fiscal support is limited, however, in this situation, and the global growth is largely supportive. So it depends on certain factors as well. If GDP growth is to be 9%, in other words, this is where we are looking at the optimistic possibility, then most people will have to be fully vaccinated. Herd immunity will have to have kicked in. Now, this means that you're looking to actually have approximately 80% of Indians eligible for vaccination to be vaccinated. That's what the 80% number is what Dr. Fauci in the United States has said. Many other experts have also said that's not going to be easy at all. Big ticket reforms have to be announced. There must be generous fiscal support, and again, global growth is very supportive. So that is something that should assist. The pessimistic scenario, and this is what India needs to get away from, is if there is a third wave which occurs impacting lives and livelihoods. We have had a horrific year. No getting away from that. We do not want a third wave. If there are no significant reforms announced, if further fiscal push to growth is negligible, and if global economies witness turbulence, then we are in trouble with GDP growth at just 5%. And that's not where we want to be at all. But joining us now, Mr. Narendran, thanks very much for being with us. Three strong possibilities given over here. In your estimation, based on what you're seeing with vaccination and based on what you're seeing in terms of sectors of the economy which appear to be growing a little bit, which of these three possibilities is most likely?
So, Vishnu, I think, firstly, thank you for having me on the show. I think the way we're looking at it is this year we are expecting growth to be 9.5%. But I think the key question is, can we keep it at that level for the next few years, right? Because 9.5% growth this year will only bring us back to where we were 2 years back, right? So it's important to keep it at that level. Now, for that, the most important element of that is vaccination. And it all depends on whether we are able to vaccinate people as fast as we should. And CII feels that we should go to about 7 million vaccines a day over the next few months on an average, if we have to get anywhere close to where we should be. So that's a very important element of the 9% growth that can come in an optimistic scenario. Now, otherwise, if you're not able to do that, we think it'll be closer to 6.5%.
So okay, that's interesting. Closer to 6.5% is what you're looking at. So let's, I've gone through a lot of the data which you've submitted on your economic growth. So let's just go through this point by point. The impact of the second wave on economic recovery. Now, if you actually look at this, then it's got a couple of important points. The second wave has had an impact on economic activity, is what CII says, between April and June. We know that. A high proportion of employees across businesses have been affected by COVID 2.0. This is critical, not spoken about enough. Rising medical expenditure has squeezed incomes. How did CII actually conduct a study looking at employees across businesses?
So we had actually reached out to 250 of our members. We had asked them it was more like a dipstick kind of thing to check how many of our members were impacted, and what you're seeing as the numbers are an outcome of that survey. So one can assume that if you scale it up, you would see a similar reflection of numbers across the industry. So obviously, large number of people were impacted, and that had an impact on the economic activity, in addition to what was the disruption, cost and demand by all that happened in the last 2 months.
In terms of GDP growth projections, and this is where we have another set of graphics which will appear, the CII expects it to be at 9.5% in FY22. This will take the GDP to a level that's slightly higher than in the financial year 2020. Now, strong growth in the second half will be supported by robust external demand and large-scale coverage of vaccination, allowing resumption of economic activity. And in the medium run, the rate can grow to 8.9% if positive actions are taken, else 5.6 is the real concern. So again, at the present rate of vaccination, which is nowhere close to where we need to be, is it your worry that we are running out of time, not just in terms of vaccinations, but the fact that we aren't manufacturing enough vaccines at this stage? There is hope, but right now many of these drugs are still in the drawing board.
Yeah. So Vishnu, we have a slightly nuanced view on this. Just now there is a vaccine shortage kind of thing. There are more people waiting to be vaccinated than there are vaccines. But we think that situation will keep getting better as the vaccine supply increases month on month, maybe less than what we would like, but certainly every month you will see more vaccines available. But I think the bigger challenge we think which will confront us over the next few months is that there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy, or if I can say so, vaccine paranoia in rural India. And unless we address that, you will reach a situation very quickly in 2 to 3 months where you have a lot of vaccinations or a lot of vaccines, but you don't have enough people willing to be vaccinated. There may be a lot of people to be vaccinated, but they should be willing to be vaccinated. And I think both the government and industry needs to work on this problem, which may hit us 2-3 months from now. If it doesn't, well and good, but we should prepare for that, because what we've seen in much smaller ways through our members, and personally I've seen it as through Tata Steel, is that there is an issue in rural India, and we need to work hard to convince a lot of people to get vaccinated. And they will only believe people that they trust, and that typically are people who belong to their local communities. So there's a lot of communication we need to do around that. And if you don't do that, the risk is there in the country of COVID-3 coming and hitting us again.
Now, I've noticed that that CII is also looking at several measures. For example, you've spoken up about the importance of stepping up oxygen supply, oxygen storage, in addition to your own measures, right? Again, to try and minimize the impact of a third wave or to avoid it altogether. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. CII had a task force to work on oxygen in the middle of the crisis of COVID-2, right? And we did a lot of good work in this area. We did a lot of modeling, a lot of work around what happens. At that point in time, we had 37 lakh active cases, right? We said if it goes to 50 lakh active cases, how much of oxygen do you need? If you go to 70 lakh active cases, how much of oxygen do you need? And the numbers were quite worrisome, because at 37 lakh active cases, you needed about 10,000 tons of liquid oxygen, which was pretty much what the country can produce, right? So hence the recommendations were a few. One is to say that any hospital, let's say over 100 beds, should have a PSA unit, and that should get mandated so that people set it up. It takes time to set up PSA units. So while just now the number of active cases are, I think, down to 14 lakhs or even less and dropping by the day, but when you have a wave 3, you should not be underprepared as far as oxygen is concerned, right? Because you cannot set up large plants overnight. You can set up these PSA units in 6 weeks or so. Secondly, last time the big constraint was the supply chain, getting cryogenic containers across the country from one end to the other. So that's why we are suggesting that there should be local storage, so that there are 15 clusters, let's say, in India, around which there are a lot of hospitals. So even if you can create storage in those 15 points, you will ease the pressures on the supply chain if and when you have a COVID-3 and a lot of requirement of oxygen. So these are some of the, then we also have a lot of suggestions around how can you make more efficient use of the oxygen? How can you have more cylinders to take care of the smaller hospitals? So there's a very detailed report we've done, which we submitted to the government so that we can be better prepared for COVID-3 if there is one.
Now, you've also called for a fiscal stimulus of 3 lakh crore rupees. How important is that in addition to whatever else we've discussed?
Yeah. So there are two things here. One is we want the government to continue to spend as was promised in the budget on infrastructure, because I think that's a great and a big and important force multiplier. It impacts multiple industries. It's a good way to get the demand back. It's a good way to get economic activity in multiple parts of the country, because a lot of that infrastructure investment is happening across the country and in rural markets and semi-urban markets. The second part is the fiscal stimulus that we're talking about is to supplement that, because you don't have much headroom as far as RBI is concerned or monetary stimulus is concerned, because interest rates are quite low and there is a concern on inflation, right? So when you look at the fiscal stimulus, what we're saying is there is a bit of a demand shock because people are postponing expenditures because their incomes have come down or they spent more on medical treatment over the last year. So there is a need to address that, get money into the hands of the people. It could be through more allocation through the Manrega scheme. Last year, I think we spent about 110,000 crores. This year, the budget is about 70,000 crores. So can we get more into that? Secondly, can we look at cutting the GST, for instance, for consumer goods by 2-3% for 6 months? We are not saying do it permanently, but just to get the confidence back into people, or so that people spend less on what they buy on a regular basis. So some of these initiatives also to support support both the MSME sector as well as the high contact businesses, which have been very significantly impacted, like the hospitality sector, the travel, aviation, etc. So some of these sectors need more support. They've struggled for the last 18 months or so. And so the stimulus of 3 lakh crore should be focused more and more on those segments.
Let's look at, and this is so very important, the CII calling for ramping up domestic vaccine production. That's common sense. We really need to do that. 175 crore doses is your target. But what you're suggesting is fast-track all necessary licensing requirements and vaccine IP owners to issue voluntary licenses along with transfer of technology. At one level, this is problematic, right? The CII is a champion of a free market economy. You're a champion of business innovation. And yet you find ourselves in an emergency, right? So for you as the CII president, was this not a tough ask, to balance this out?
No, absolutely. And I think it's something where there are different views. We recognize that. But I think, while this may not solve the problem for the next few months, because the best way to solve the problem for the next few months is to get existing producers to ramp up, because they would be able to do it faster than somebody who's just getting new into this business, right? But I think what we're saying is this vaccination is here to stay, right? Even if we vaccinate all the people that we want to vaccinate this year, doesn't mean that you don't need to do vaccination next year, right? So there is a need for us to look at vaccination very differently. And if we have to protect ourselves against COVID, wave 3, wave 4, wave 5, or any other variations of COVID that will be around for some time, we need to make sure that we have enough capacity to produce the vaccines as well as to kind of vaccinate people. So I think it's more in that context. It's more a medium to longer term solution than something which will solve our problem for the next 6 months.
Okay. Advance purchase agreements, that's so important. And again, this has been a problem in the past. Many people say last year we should have bought many more vaccines because it's had a, an impact going down the road. If we hadn't bought earlier on, we have a shortage now. Exports of vaccines have stopped. We're trying to step up manufacture, and yet we are short on the vaccination process over here. You are over here calling for advance purchase agreements. In other words, an import, a requirement for imports is still there, right?
Either imports or domestic manufacturers commit to them capacity, monies, so that they expand, because if you have one customer and that's a government, then you need some comfort that, yes, I'm going to get the business, I'm going to get the money, and then you invest in growing capacity, because I think we need everyone to ramp up capacities to support the requirements as far as vaccination is concerned. So I think this is one way of giving them the comfort that they have orders which are secure and monies which are paid, and I think the government did that a few weeks back. So if that is done for the scale that we want, in sort of a mutually agreed phasing out, I think that helps bring certainty to vaccine manufacturers and gives them the confidence to keep investing to grow capacities.
Capital subsidies in the grants to incentivize production. Now, this is what, for example, America did last year with Operation Warp Speed. Trump was the president then. He was an anti-vaxxer, but they still set out with $10 billion odd, which they said that, look, we are dedicating these funds. We are giving advances, preliminary orders to many companies trying to develop this vaccine. Some will not work, and we accept that it will not work. We accept that there will be financial losses to that end, but we need to go out and we need to encourage innovation. We will champion distribution. We will help in distribution and expanding manufacture. So in a sense, is CII sort of influenced by what we've seen elsewhere in the world, where if you don't encourage production in whichever form it is, then we are going to be stuck later?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we are proposing is less riskier than what the US did. Right? The US did it before the vaccines were developed.
Correct.
So you did not know whether you were putting money behind the right product, right? So here the product is known. You're only asking for the money to be put on expanding capacity and production, and there is a requirement for the vaccine. So I think there is less risk in what we are proposing than what was done by the US last year. But yes, I think that's a good way to approach the thing so that there is no uncertainty as far as supply is concerned.
Are you optimistic about where we are going with our pharma industry, specifically about COVID and vaccine manufacturers? Because there are many. In fact, I personally believe that going forward, some of the technologies, some of the vaccines coming online from companies like Zydus, from some of the newer vaccines being developed by Serum, Bharat Biotech and BioE, which has got an unbelievable price point, might actually be the vaccines which are going to vaccinate the world. We're talking about India, absolutely. But that manufacturing capacity and the price advantage, which we've always inherently had, is going to be a huge success story, maybe not this year, but starting early next year.
Certainly. I mean, India was actually the vaccine manufacturing capital of the world. The rest of the world got into it because of the pandemic and scaled up capacities over the last year. No reason that India shouldn't get back that share of the global market that it had before. And the demand for vaccines will continue to grow because you need to take care of the rest of the world as well, right? You have 1 billion people in Africa with very low vaccination rates. So there are a lot of countries out there who need the vaccines. And I think, so that's an opportunity. And it is not a one-off kind of activity. It goes on. Secondly, I think the world is far more conscious about these kind of situations. So there will be better preparation for future such pandemics. And I think that will mean that a lot more work will need to be done in future vaccines as well. So I think India has a great opportunity here. It has a great track record and we need to build on that. And we have a lot of talented scientists and capabilities in India. Why not leverage that?
Yep. And finally, CII says there needs to be a vaccine minister. What would he or she do?
Well, here we've been inspired by what happened in the UK. UK has a vaccine SAR kind of thing. I think the fundamental point we are saying is the next 6 months extremely critical. And we cannot let it, hope that it will all magically come into place, right? There are multiple stakeholders involved. You have the central government, you have the state government, you have the private sector hospitals, the public sector hospitals, you have the vaccine manufacturers, you have urban India, rural India. And if we need to scale up from 3 million to 7 million or 8 million or 9 million vaccines a day, that will not happen by just making sure the supply is there. I mean, you need to think through the supply chain, you need to think through the bottlenecks, you need to plan for it, because at a point in time when you have a lot of vaccine production but not enough vaccinations happening, you also have a shelf life for the vaccines, right? So there are many challenges that we need to think through, and we need to make sure that we do it well and do it correctly so that we don't have a situation in COVID-3 that we had in COVID-2.
Yeah. And you use a dashboard approach and share progress reports daily. This is important, a real-time monitoring of progress, right?
For such a complex project, I mean, if you were to look at it from a corporate mindset, this is a very, very complex project. So you would need to have, pretty much information flowing on a daily basis and available to the decision makers so that you can also keep shifting vaccine supplies to the parts of the country where the COVID outbreak is happening faster than we think. There could be parts of the country where the vaccinations are happening faster than we think. So we need to make optimal use of the vaccine so that it's not in the wrong place at the wrong time.
All right. Mr. Narendran, congratulations on the new position. It's been lovely speaking to you, and I think this is very forward-looking what you've suggested, the importance of vaccination. It's something we stress each and every day. It's so important not just to save lives, but for our economic growth going forward as well. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Vishnu, for having me on the show.